Thank you for that very warm introduction, and thank you for the welcome to your wonderful town. Thank you, Mayor. I would like to recognize everyone that is here from all the various institutions and organizations. I must say this is my first time to Guyana, and I wish I were here for longer, because there's so much I've heard that you can do in Guyana, and the people here are so warm. They remind me so much of Jamaicans, just the spirit and the friendliness. So I definitely have it on my mind to come back sometime in the future. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is what we call access rights. And access rights is about the right to obtain environmental information, the right to participate in decisions that affect the environment, and the right to obtain remedies through the law if there's a violation of the environment, or to protect those rights. So, if you could come, please. So these pictures, I think, kind of give you an example of what access rights are and why they're important. And these two pictures demonstrate some conflicts that have happened in Trinidad when people have felt that they've been denied the right to participate in a decision that affects the environment. So on the left, there are some women who are protesting outside of the government agency that's responsible for granting approvals for developments. And they're protesting a decision to allow a smelter plant to be built in their area. On the right is a very, I think, famous Trinidadian, certainly I think in the region, who is on a hunger fast. And this is his way of protesting a development within the region. So what they have in common, there are different ways that these people have found to make their voice heard about when they felt that there was something that they disagreed with, and that they wanted the government to know that this was important to them, and this was their way of trying to bring across what their concerns were. And on the picture here, this is how we deal with it in Jamaica. We block the road, they call it. We find everything, car tire, garbage, and we block the road. And that is our usual way of dealing with protests. But what I want to talk about is a different way of dealing with problems, of dealing with this particular issue where you want to bring across a concern you have about a proposal to do something within your community, your region, your country, that you think is very important, that might have negative impacts on the environment. And how do you let the government know that this is important? How do you participate in that decision? How do you get the opportunity to be consulted? And there are better ways to do it, and there are other ways. So recently, the government of Guyana, I don't know if many of you know, but they signed an international agreement between Latin American and the Caribbean countries, where they agreed to introduce laws that give people the rights to obtain environmental information, to participate, to be consulted within decisions that affect the environment, and also to obtain legal remedies through the laws, through the courts, sorry, if there is a violation of those rights, or if there's something that affects the environment in a very negative way. And there's several things that you can think of when you want to consult, or you want to be consulted, and you want to participate. There's several barriers that you can think of might occur. Literacy. So the reality is, in the Caribbean, not everybody can read and write. And there's that basic level of illiteracy, but there's also the fact that many times when a project or proposal is presented, it's done in a very technical way. The language that is used is very scientific, and people might not be able to understand that. Communication channels. So how do you communicate with people? Not everywhere in the country, in the region, may have access to internet. If you put all the information on the internet, those people who don't have access to internet may not obtain the information. The cost for participating. So I find that Guyana is very progressive in that the government actually appears to go around into communities and consult people on various projects and proposals and developments. But that's not the case in every country in the Caribbean. In some cases, people have to travel to the actual capital or centers or cities to learn more, to attend public meetings and to learn more about proposals and development. And that can have a cost attached to it. Exposure to risk from participation. So if there's a proposal to do something and it is very, let us say it brings a lot of investment, it is seen as very positive for the country, those people who may choose to speak out against it might be victimized, may feel oppressed by the decision to do that. And then the cultural context is important because people, you have to recognize that people may have, and different groups may have different ways of understanding information, of meeting, and you know, we wish the government and definitely the consultation procedures should recognize that and should be geared towards meeting and facilitating that type of way of consulting. So this agreement that the government of Ghana has signed, it's called the Escazu Agreement, is really about breaking down some of these barriers. So I won't go too much into the background of it, but it basically, the concept behind this idea that people should be consulted and should have the right to participate in decisions that affect the environment is coming way back. Even though this is a new agreement, it is basically originates from a concept that is decades old. From 1992, there was a principle that many countries adopted that people have these rights. And then in 2012, there was a follow-up conference where countries again came together, including the government of Ghana, and they stressed the importance of recognizing that this is an important principle that should be followed in their countries. So what happened is that at that time in 2012, 10 countries came together. Ghana was not a part of that at the time, and they decided, let's work together and try to come up with an international agreement, a regional agreement for our countries that actually has standards for access to information, for participation, and justice. Can you move on? So 24 countries in the region participated in the negotiation of this agreement. I should say that 8 of the 24 countries were Caribbean at that time that participated. And the agreement, which was adopted in March of this year, was open for signatures last week. And 15 countries actually signed it, including the government of Ghana. One of the things that is interesting about the way this agreement was negotiated is that it involved the public. And this is something that is very unusual for international agreements, in that members of the public could actually go to these meetings and actually present proposals on what should be in the agreement. And certain members of the public were actually appointed to lead the way in which the public opinion was gathered and presented in those negotiation meetings. So these persons were called elected representatives of the public, and I am one of them. 6 of them were elected for the region. All right, so I just briefly talk about the agreement because I think it's very significant, because the government of Guyana has signed on to this agreement, and we anticipate that at some point they will ratify it, meaning they will become legally bound to do what the agreement says, I think it's all important to give you an idea of what the future of participation may look like for Guyana in terms of the standards. You already have very high standards, I must say, in the region. I'm very impressed by what I know of the laws and the way things are done in Guyana, which I think is very different from many countries in the region. But these are just examples of some of the standards that the government will have to live up to in the region. So in terms of access to environmental information, I just wanted to ask a question out there. And has anyone here ever wanted information about the environment from a government agency, a government department? Has anyone ever asked for information? Think about things like the quality of the water. Think about things like if a permit or approval was granted for a project in your community. Has anyone ever wanted that type of information, ever asked for it? Okay. Well, maybe that's because you already have everything you want is proactively released. But many people in the country, they want these types of information. And sometimes you want this information because you want to be involved in decisions. Sometimes you want to know what's coming. And sometimes it's a situation where there is something that you need to avoid some great tragedy, like some threat to your livelihood, to your environment, to your work, and having that information is important to have. So many countries have laws on access to information, or freedom of information as it's called. It's an interesting fact, but Belize was actually the first country in the region to have a law on access to information. When I say in the region, I am including Latin America too. So that is pretty significant. And Guyana, as you may know, has a law that says everyone has the right to request information from the government, with certain exemptions, but a general right to do so. And that law was passed in 2011. So what is environmental information? It's very broad. The environment can mean anything. The environment can mean not only natural resources, so like trees, plants, water, air, information about that, but it can also mean your physical environment, meaning buildings, construction type roads. It's defined to mean to be interpreted very broadly to cover a lot. And something interesting, it also talks about environmental risks specifically within this agreement. So wanting to know if this happens, what is the risk that may flow? So, for example, if the case I spoke of earlier with the smelter plant in Trinidad, which if I don't know if you know about aluminum processing, you know, foil paper, when that's being processed is part of the whole smeltering aluminum process. But people were concerned about the health risks. People were concerned about potential to get cancer as a result of that. And that environmental risk that that could be attributed towards that project is included in this definition of when you say environmental information, what type of information can I get? So I won't go into detail with this, but there's also a requirement for countries to proactively release information. So without you having to ask for information, there should be information that the government actually disseminates readily without you having to ask for it. And these are some of the things that should be within that type of proactive dissemination policy. So this is just an example of another thing that the agreement requires. It's called a pollutant release transfer system. I won't go too much into it, but in essence, it lets you know certain types of pollution that's released, that is considered hazardous. It lets you know where those pollution spots are, or sources of pollution, and who are the persons who are releasing it, and the quantity. And so now, I don't know if Guyana has this, but this is something that the government of Guyana is going to have to do in compliance with this agreement, as well as the other countries that have signed on. So this is a story I want to give you about Jamaica and why having information is important. So we have in Jamaica what we call dump sites. We don't have properly managed locations for where garbage is disposed of. And in Kingston, where we have about 1 million people living, we have one dump site. It collects 60% of the garbage in the country. And what happens every year, practically, is that huge fires occur on that dump site. And what you're looking at is the Riverton dump site that I'm speaking of, and a huge fire that's occurring there. And people live right adjoining the dump site. And you can imagine the smoke, the health problems that a lot of people have when these fires occur every year. And with this agreement, some of the things that the government of Jamaica will have to do, will have to let people know immediately what the quality of air is like within their communities, what measures people can do to protect themselves, and all of that information is required to provide, has to be provided to those communities within a certain period of time that would allow them to actually take measures to protect themselves. So public participation, I'm not going to go too much into this, but many countries within the Caribbean, we have laws and practices about how the public should be consulted, much in the way that we're doing now. And the agreement says that there are certain things you have to consult people in. So projects that would have an impact on the environment, yes, but also plans and programs are also important. And so, yeah, keep going. So, no, to the previous one, right, this one. So, I have here a picture which I got from a Guyanese lawyer. Her name is Melinda Miles. I don't know if many of you will be familiar with her, but she's actually done a lot of work with Amerindian communities and meeting with them, and I've learned a lot about the way communities, Amerindian communities, make decisions. And it's not all the same, and there are different ways it's done. And a lot of her work has been trying to get consultation processes to be done in a way that meets what the community standard is and how it should be done. And here she is meeting with communities, and that's part of what the agreement says. It says that if you're consulting people, you should do them in the way that they are familiar with, that is their practice of being consulted. But sorry, I said man as Janky, yes, Janky. Thank you. I know I'm Melinda Miles, so I got a little turned around with that. So some of the things that the agreement talks about is the date and the place where you should be consulted. Everyone should know. The way in which you're going to be consulted, everybody should know. And who is involved in making the decision, everybody should know. And you should know this early enough to make a difference. We have this feeling in Jamaica in particular that when you're consulting me, you've already decided what you're going to do. And there's nothing I can say that can make a difference. But what this agreement is saying that you need to consult people early so that they themselves can influence the outcome, as in whatever that proposal is that you're going to do. So these are just some of the things that you would have to also include in that participation procedure. I won't go into depth in that. Just to mention, when it is that you are commenting on a proposal, when you're being consulted, how do you know that actually what you have proposed is being considered? I can talk to you. You can sit here much like you're doing right now and listen to me. And I don't know if you are thinking about something else. You could be thinking about a TV show that you're wishing you could be at home watching right now. You could be thinking about some pot on the fire, something you have cooking. How do I know you actually care about what I'm saying? That this is something that actually matters to you? How do you know? And that has been a complaint by a lot of people who have been consulted historically in the past. How do I know that when the government or developer or whoever has this project is coming to me, how do I know when I talk to them and I tell them what I'm concerned about, that it actually matters, that they're actually listening to what I'm saying? And so what this agreement says is that as a final step in the consultation procedure, I have to tell you what my decision was, yes, but I also have to tell you how I considered what you told me. Whatever comments you gave me, how did I consider them? So if you said, for example, I don't want you to build that road through my community because, let us say, you're going to have to cut down these trees, or this important building will have to be moved, the government has to say, or the project developer has to say, well, we thought about what you said, and this is how we are addressing that issue. So that feedback to tell you how they considered your comments has to be part of the consultation procedure. And then talking about access to justice. So access to justice is talking about, okay, so you're supposed to be doing everything you're doing, but something went wrong, or you think something went wrong. What do you do at that point? Who do you complain to? How do you complain? How do you get an opportunity to right what you perceived was a wrong? And in the Caribbean, I must say, we have really good standards for access to justice. So if any government, public authority or agency does something that you perceive is illegal or wasn't done in a proper way, you have the right to challenge that. And that's something that is very significant about the region because of our history, our connection with the English legal system, common law system. So in terms of challenges, what type of challenges can you make? This is the synopsis. These are the examples of what type of challenges you can make. So if you try to get information on the environment and you refuse that information, or they just completely ignore you, you can challenge that. If you're trying to participate in a decision that affects the environment, and let us say you didn't get the opportunity to do so, or the way in which it was done was not done in the way that according to the standards set out in this agreement, you should be able to challenge that. And then this third part, which is pretty significant, if there is a negative impact on the environment, you should be able to challenge it. And this is pretty significant because as I said, environment is very broad, and it's not only specific to you as an individual. So even if something does not affect you specifically, or you only, you can also challenge it if it affects the environment. So wait, could you go back? So this is a picture of some members of the Maya Leaders Alliance in Belize. And I don't know if you're aware, but for many years they have been in a dispute with the government of Belize about land ownership, and they're trying to assert their collective rights to land. It's a different situation, I understand it, and if I'm wrong, correct me, than Guyana, where you more or less have a proper procedure, laws that recognize that they're indigenous people, they can own land, and this is how it's done, and it's within legislation and it's respected. But in Belize, that is not the case in many circumstances. And so these group of indigenous people banded together and they went to the courts, and it's actually been going on for more than a decade. It's at the Caribbean Court of Justice now, or was heard at the Caribbean Court of Justice, and they were awarded reparations from the government of Belize because the court recognized that you have denied them their land rights. You have denied them, and that is something that they are entitled to because they are the first peoples, they are the indigenous peoples, and this is something that the law should recognize, and you need to make sure that the law recognizes that. And so they got an award from the Caribbean Court of Justice for that. So I won't go into much detail in this, but these are some of the things that you need. So leave it on this screen. If anybody has ever tried to go to court, it can seem very daunting, a process. How do you do it? first thing you think is, I need a lawyer, because they're the ones who are the ones who facilitate my action, my court redress. That means I need money, because I need to pay the lawyer. And how do I even begin that process? And a lot of people don't even bother because they say, oh, it's just too much right now. I can't even bother to even think about how to do this and to come up with the money, and we just let things go and let things slide. Well, what this agreement says is that the governments will now try to have measures to reduce all of those things, those obstacles to you being able to access your legal remedies. So the cost issue is one thing, that's a huge thing. The government will have to make it affordable for people to go to courts. And that's a huge thing in changing the whole dynamic of the way that things are done. They also have to provide technical assistance to help you to bring your matters to court. And that is also very significant. So environmental defenders. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the term environmental defender. Has anyone ever heard of it? It's something that's not very commonly, a term not very commonly known in the Caribbean, but in Latin America in particular, we have these groups of people, and when I say groups of people, it's not like a particular race, ethnicity, or anything. These are just people who defend the environment. And it's not only something that they do as part of their work. These are people who could just be regular people, who there's something happening within their community they're concerned about, and they're trying to advocate against it. And they call them, they're known as, the term is, they're known as environmental defenders. And it could be anyone. You could have environmental defenders sitting down here right now, and maybe you don't even know that that's what people would call you. But you could be an environmental defender. And what the agreement says is that it recognizes that many of these people are persecuted and oppressed because they choose to stand up and speak out about something they don't agree with. In 2016, for example, 200 environmental defenders were killed in Latin America. And this is a huge number, and in the years since then, it has continued to grow. There's a picture there of a lady, Berta Carceres, who was one of the environmental defenders, well-known ones, who was killed, and sort of became I don't call it martyr, but that became like a symbol of why attention needs to be brought to this problem of people who choose to stand up and speak about the environment being persecuted and being oppressed. And so the agreement says that the government should protect those people. If you know there's a risk when somebody stands up and speaks about the environment, there's a risk of harm to them, the government should take action to protect them. If there is harm that occurs, the government should investigate it, should punish the offenders, and there should be an enabling environment to support the work and the advocacy that those people do. And this is the first agreement in the entire world that recognizes these people and the obligation to protect them. Okay, so the agreement also specifically recognizes what they call groups, individuals and groups in vulnerable situations, as well as indigenous people. There's specific clauses about what needs to be done to ensure that they can have these rights of information and participation and justice. And a lot of them are focused on offering technical and financial assistance, yes, but also recognizing their culture. So whenever you're giving these rights to these people, you have to recognize their particular cultural dynamic. If their official language is different from what generally the country speaks, English or whatever, then if you're consulting them, you need to consult them in their language. The information needs to be in their language. And that's something that is also very significant about this agreement. There's a picture there of some Maroons in Jamaica. I don't know if you know about Maroons, but they're escaped slaves who in Jamaica, they have still retained their distinct cultural heritage to some respects. And there is a feeling or a thinking that, well, I wouldn't say a feeling or a thinking, but there is a movement towards recognizing Maroons as having the same rights as indigenous people. you're interested in this agreement and what's coming forward for you in the future as Guyanese people, what the government will be doing, there's ways that you can get involved in the process. So there is a subscription database, so you can subscribe to get information about it, to learn what events are coming up in terms of the agreement and how it will be implemented for the region and in particular your country. And that's the website there if you're interested in that. And that's basically it. Now, what does this all have to do with the green economy? There is a feeling that when we talk about the green economy, when we talk about economic development, that it has to happen in a certain way or should happen in a certain way. And that way needs to involve the participation of the people. It needs to be fair and it needs to be socially inclusive. So it needs to recognize that every individual has the right to determine how their country, how their economic growth should happen. And the environment is a very important factor in that. It needs to be protected, and a way in which we do so is doing that with a full participation, with having everybody on board, or at least having the opportunity to have their voices and concerns in how the economy should go heard. So I don't know if you have any questions, or is there a question afterwards? All right, so that's basically it. My information is there if you're interested in emailing me. If you want to learn more about the process, I'll be happy to respond to you. And thank you.